therefore, you're going to have a coarser grid because you don't need to go this fine anymore in the near wall region. You don't have to be in the viscous sublayer. You want to be just outside of the buffer layer, viscous sublayer and buffer layer. So at this point means that the very first point here, the very first point in here should be, the y plus of it would be about 30 to 50. So that means you use a lot less points in order to do the turbulence modeling here. And there are many different kind of functions to put in here. One is standard wall function, enhanced wall function. If you have a non-equilibrium wall function, two-layer zones. There are many different kinds that you could use as well. Now, one of the problem was, if you remember this, we talked about these problems right here. We said epsilon is the dissipation rate of the smallest eddies. It will tell you, it will help you to establish the length scale if you use K and over epsilon in order to get the length scale. But we're using the information from the large eddy scales. So when we're doing this, people said some of the problem we have with K epsilon comes from that fact that we use the information from the large scale. So let me restate what I just said, emphasize again. The transport equation for K was relatively exact, right? So we had, it's based on the mean flow, that's fine. We said epsilon is really the physical reasoning. We said, okay, whatever is happening at the large scale dissipation, it should happen at the smaller scale. And so we could use that as our length scale at the small scale. So we use physical reasoning, but there is no really exact relationship there. So the assumption is that fluid is fully turbulent. This caused us problem. K epsilon seems to be overly diffusive in many applications. Especially you have much, streamline curvature, strokes, and so forth. If you have adverse pressure gradient, it seems to be not as responsive to that adverse pressure gradient. And we had problem with the round jet and other problems. And near the wall, we talked about either we have to do wall function or wall integration and so forth. Something we had to do something different. So because of these problems, people came up with different variation of K epsilon to respond to these deficiencies. One is called RNG, renormalization group method, K epsilon. It's basically derived from a statistical technique. And basically it says, the problem comes from epsilon. Why don't we have a fix for that? And we'll put an additional strain terms in there to account for different scales of motion. So that was kind of nice because it helped with problem with the rapidly straining flows or flows with the streamline curvature. Unfortunately, it still assumes that mu t is isotropic. And because of that, it doesn't do so well for swirling flows. Another modification to K epsilon is called realizable. And that means that this C mu, of those 5 constants that we talked about, C mu should be a variable rather than a constant. And this would help this would change a little bit in the epsilon equation again. Because again, like I said, people were trying to respond to this epsilon. So K stays the same, but the epsilon changes a little bit. Again, we see more improvement for recirculations, rotations, and separations. Once again, the assumption stays the same in terms of mu t being isotropic, and which would not help us with swirling flows. Okay. So those are two. And then again, if people said epsilon is the problem, why don't we replace it with something else? So Wilcox came in with K omega model, and it's an alternative to K epsilon because you didn't have to worry about whether you're going to go wall function or wall integration, and if you go to wall integration, you have to do some sort of damping function here, and all that stuff. Says, okay, why don't we just go ahead and replace that epsilon with omega, omega being mathematically epsilon over k, which is the inverse time scale, so it's going to give you some sort of time scale here. And so mu t is rho k over omega, and well, what it did was k would stay the same, a little bit modified version, I think, and then the epsilon is replaced by omega. Now you didn't have to worry about near wall function or wall integration. You could go all the way to the wall and be able to get the effect all the way to the wall without doing much. So the strength was that you could use it for boundary layer flows, even with separation to adverse pressure gradient. Unfortunately, it seems to have an effect. What you chose as your boundary, I guess as in your boundary condition in far field here, what you chose for omega affected your flow near the wall. So I had a very sensitivity to far field, which that's not very good because that take away some of your freedom here, how to go about doing things. You have to really be careful and how you set up your far field. So if you look at it, in K epsilon was really good away from the wall, and K omega was really good near the wall, but it's kind of sensitive. So Mentor decided, well, why don't we use the benefits of omega and the benefits of K epsilon, K omega and K omega, and kind of use both of them at the same time in order to take benefits from those and not to have to worry about the either the far field conditions that we set in here, because K epsilon is going to take care of that, and then we don't have to do about wall function or wall integration because K omega is going to take care of that. So the SST model, the shear stress transport model by Mentor, K omega, as I said, is overly sensitive to free stream values or boundary conditions of omega. K epsilon is not. K omega performs much better than K epsilon near the wall in the boundary layer, which was the handicap with K epsilon. So you mix these two, you come up with the shear stress transform. It's a blend of K omega and K epsilon. It takes advantage of both of them. So when you use this model, when it comes near the wall, it uses K omega. When it's a little bit further away from the wall, it uses K epsilon. So what it did was it really gives you good behavior at adverse pressure gradient. So if you have separating flows, it really does well. And it goes all the way to the wall without using any kind of damping mechanism. The problem is it may produce large turbulence regions when you have, for example, regions with strong accelerations or stagnation regions. One of the things is it needs to decide, the code usually decides where to go between, where to switch between K epsilon and K omega and K epsilon. And sometimes when you do have, for example, free shear layers, you don't have that wall dependency. So so that's all of a sudden it becomes a trouble. So you may want to go back to K omega instead of SSD model. All right, so I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to talk about the URANs. We've had a couple of questions about this thing over the forum, I think. So we'll talk about URANs a little bit here, and I think this is a good time to take a break. I'm about 2 minutes past the hour.
Okay, looks like it is 2 minutes past the hour, and so we'll return at 7 minutes past the hour. And as a reminder, if you have any questions for Cameron, please post them in the Q&A.
It's more of a
okay, our 5 minutes is up, and time to move on. I am not seeing any questions posted. How about you, Cameron? Do you see any?
No, I don't have any either. So
okay.
We'll wait toward the end again. We'll ask if there's any questions. And again, a couple of folks have used the forum to ask questions, and that's good enough for me. I mean, those are the places where you have more, I guess, more of a deeper questions could be asked there. Here, maybe we could talk about some of these slides and so forth. But any question is a good question. So don't hesitate. Either places would be fine. So let's get started again, and we'll talk about unsteady RANs or URANs. So remember, when we did the averaging, one of the things that happened was because of averaging, this term dropped out. And the unsteadiness of turbulence went away. So we treat it as if, because it's timed average, we're no longer dealing with unsteadiness. So, but there are cases, for example, when you do have an internal combustion engine, when the piston moving back and forth, or helicopter rotor is moving in a periodic way, or for example, if you have flow over a blob body like a cylinder or sphere, and you would get that type of vortex shedding that happens in the back, in the wake area. These happen in a periodic or sort of a large unsteady, large-scale unsteadiness. So if we went ahead and put that term back in, you don't get any more of those unsteadiness like U bar and U prime and V prime. You don't get those, but the large unsteadiness you could include. So that's what URANs is. Now, URANs means you could have in any of those terms that you have, like SA, any of those models, SA model, K epsilon, K omega, all of those things, if you keep this term on, that would be an URANs, and it could be any of these models could be done. So one of the advantages is because now you've got some unsteadiness into your calculation. Therefore, it's a lot easier to combine this turbulence modeling, RANS modeling with LES or DES. So, of course, the time step that you're going to use, it's important for URAN. The model type, again, just like we talked about, K omega might be good for this, or K epsilon would be good for this, or SA model would be good for something. Again, that would be important as well. So I think that's a question we had about the URANs, and I wanted to discuss that, how that comes about. So, in terms of Reynolds stress model, RSM, if you remember, I said one assumption was Boussinet's hypothesis, where we set these things and write them in terms of this mu t. Another way is actually say, all right, we'll have an equation for any of these Reynolds stress terms. And so that means we're going to have 6 additional partial differential equations. And we'll have, so this would be our velocity scale. And then we'll have 1 additional equation for length scale, maybe for using for dissipation epsilon. So now you've got 7 additional equations, 7 additional PDE that you have to work with, as opposed to 2 for K epsilon. And what it is no longer you have that assumption that mu t is isotropic. Now you don't have that assumption. So it does, this model works really well for flows that they have streamline curvatures, especially swirling type of flows, cyclone flows and swirling combustor flows and so forth. So it does really well for those type of problems. So what's its shortcoming? Well, first of all, you have 7 equations as opposed to 2. It's more expensive. The second one is now you're coupling because before that you had K and epsilon. You could solve them separately after you calculate your values like U, V, and those kind of stuff. And so they're decoupled, and then you go back and calculate them again and so forth. So these are decoupled. But now that you put these in there, they're coupled. Momentum and turbulence equations are coupled. They have to be solved at the same time. And you're dealing with very big differences in length scales and velocity scales and so forth. And the larger scale differences make this kind of numerically stiff. So mainly means it has a hard time getting started and started to, for your residual to start to come down and so forth. So it'll take a long time to do that. So it becomes a numerically stiff type of problem. So if you look at turbulence modeling and what kind of grid you need, it's really complicated, or I should say not complicated, but interdependent. So turbulence modeling that you choose, along with the wall treatment you choose, it really depends on flow physics and what kind of accuracy you're looking for. And then the computational resources is available to you. Now, the wall treatment is going to be dictated by what kind of grid you already have. So if you create a grid with y plus of 1, then maybe you could use wall integration. If you have a coarser grid, you get wall function. So that kind of affects the computational resources, and based on that, if you don't have the computational resources, then you can't use certain models. Not only that, the turnaround time would be different. So wall treatment strategy dictates the computational computational resources. That would dictate what kind of resources, computational grid, and that would determine what kind of computational resources you need and what kind of turnaround time you're going to get. So all of these things are sort of interdependent on how you go about modeling something. So let's take a look at this thing, for example. In terms of wall integration, we said the y plus of the very first point should be close to 1. So in this case, you could use it for A model, K epsilon, K omega, SSD. And you have to have a finer grid all the way to here, to the wall. If you choose to use wall function, so at this point your y plus is further away. So the very first point that you create is away from the wall. And so you want to be somewhere between 30 to 50. And then you're going to use K epsilon models and so forth. So let's take a look at for example, how do we create our grid to respond to y plus of, let's say, 30, right? How do we do wall function? So in the past, what we used to, one way to do it, let me put it this way. One way to do it is you generate a grid, you run your case, you look at it, and you say, okay, this is y plus of something, and no, I want it to be y plus of something else, so you go back and re-modify it. So that's one way to do it, but in order to help doing that, it maybe at least start with a good guess. So, let's say, I'll give you an example in here. You want to look at a flow in a pipe, and these are the conditions given to us. And I'm looking for a generated grid for y plus of close to 30. How do I go about doing that? So the initial grid I'm going to generate, at least it should be close enough so I don't have to do this over and over again. So if I look at this thing, first thing I do is I look at the Reynolds number, and the Reynolds number seems to be much greater than 2300, so the flow is turbulent. So I'm aiming for y plus of equal to 30. So what kind of grid do I need? So if I look at in the literature for flow inside the pipe, in the textbook, you could see the coefficient of friction is related to Reynolds number for a turbulent flow in this form. And tells me for our Reynolds number, CF would be about 0.007. So CF is related to shear stress. So 0.5 CF times V squared. So that's going to be my shear stress. Now remember, we had friction velocity was square root of tau shear stress divided by density. So if I put this one in here, I'm going to get U tau about 0.04. And if you remember the equation, how we did non-dimensionalization for y plus was y ut divided by multiplied by rho divided by mu, if I remember it correctly. So now I was looking for 30 here. I know what ut would be. I know what rho density is, so I could calculate. Now I could calculate what y plus is. So put it in here, and it says, oh, I'm sorry. Now I know what y would be. So y, so you put 30 in here. The conditions for mu and for the fluid is given to me. And I just calculated ut. So it says the very first point, physically, the very first point for the grid should be 8 millimeters away from the wall. So that gives you my first crack at generating the grid. Then I'll run it, I'll look at it again to see if it's true, and then and then I'll do it again, refine it if I need to. But at least that gives you an idea how to start with the process. So this is, of course, this Y plus is not going to be always like this, because some geometries are much more complicated than that, so it will be difficult to generate exactly this type of grid always. But that stays a range, maybe between 30 to 50, you should be okay. So one of the things we deal with, we've talked about this over and over again, that some of the turbulence modeling, they're not so good for massively separated flows. So if you look at it, flow behind this cylinder is fairly much separated in the wake area. So what do? We said LES was really good for large scale eddies, but it was not so good near the wall. And RANs were good near the wall, but they didn't do so well for massively separated flows. So the assumption is if you could combine the two, have some sort of hybrid method, then we'll take advantage of LES in the large scale and RANs in smaller scale and be able to do a much better job. So the detached eddy simulation is among those scale resolving models where there's a hybrid of LES and RANs. So for example, Javier was asking about LES. Yes, we need to know more about LES because for these type of flows, it comes into really some sort of help for us. Here, for example, this application that at Arizona State done. So DES combines the favorable aspects of both LES and RANs, and a lot of applications people started looking at it. It is more computationally more affordable than LES. So, and I put that I put a paper out on the forum when Javier asked me about that, and that paper is really responding toward these hybrid methods, that detached eddy simulation, these type of methods. I think they call it the scale resolving method. So that's what they're talking about, the computational more affordable than LES, but it doesn't require that kind of a fine grid near the surface as LES requires. The only thing is sometimes it's sensitive to the type of grid that you generate because you don't want it to be too fine for RANs, but you don't want it to be too coarse for LES. So at that point, that kind of has to be a little bit of a careness must be put into generating your grid. All right, so I gave you a bunch of different models and even hybrid methods. And the question is, how do I go about choosing one model? What works for me? What would work for me? What would not work for me? How would it work for me? That kind of question.
Una mamá quiere hablar con usted, pero les dije que casi era imposible sobrevivir.
How do I go choosing a model? And then, which is a very, very difficult question. And I don't know if I have the answer for you, but at least I could maybe help a little bit here in this respect. So let's just say there is no one method that works for all kind of flow applications. Okay, so we know that. That's why there are so many different methods. And we know that each one of them would have certain accuracy and effectiveness, depending on your application. What would affect your application? The effectiveness, accuracy, maybe the pressure gradient, buoyancy, some other stuff that even further change the effectiveness. So if you choose a model, that model should depend on the flow physics that you have for your application. Establish what people are using for that type of method. That's very helpful. Level of accuracy that you need. And then if those models are available to you, and then do you have the computational resources? So if you, for example, you want to use RSM, and you don't have the time or the computational resources to do that, or if you want DES, and you don't have that kind of computational resources, then you can't use it. And the timing that you need. So in order to see these type of answers, look at these factors, you got to do some research, all right? Mainly to see for your type of problem, what is the established practice? Because people have looked at these things, many different applications. People have been looking at different type of turbulence models for different things, and they have refined some models. For example, for certain applications, they've changed the standard K epsilon to something more refined. So you want to know what people have used. So that would be your starting point, rather than start and checking every single model to see which one does better for your case. So, first of all, in terms of what kind of model to choose, the first thing you want to do is look at the Reynolds number. See if you're indeed turbulent before you embark on using a turbulence model. The other thing is you want to look to see what people have used for your class of problem. If there is a model that has been modified for your type of problem, then maybe you could use it. If it's not been modified for yours, it's been modified for some other kind of thing, stay away from it. You're better off using the standard model. So let's say you don't know what type of application people have used in your what kind of model they've used for your type of application. So here's general guidelines. Use K epsilon first. It's mostly robust, reasonable accuracy. It works for many different applications. It's available in many CFD codes. If you don't have a low Reynolds number type of problem, then use Wolf function to begin with. For flows with wall-bounded flows where you have separation, you want to go to SST model. For more aerodynamic application, use SA model instead of these two other ones. If you have Stirling model, go with RSM model. So you don't know and you don't have any clear choice, try these for these type of problems. So as I mentioned, you start with some sort of idea for Y plus, perform the simulation, and then try to refine till you get the desirable Y plus. And of course, you need to do some reality check. If you can do experiments, great. If not, do the comparison between different models, do some grid sensitivity analysis and all that stuff. Get an idea where you should be going. When I said look to see what people have done so if I go back here, I said establish practice for your class of a problem. So one of the things is you could do some search. I did some simple searches here, for example. If you're looking for pollutant dispersions, there is a study that people have done, a comparative study of various turbulence models. Looking at cavity type problem, a comparison of turbulence model coefficient. For conjugate heat transfer mini channels, compares models for conjugate heat transfer. Comparative study for diffuser. A new turbulence model for separated flow. So there's a bunch of different applications that have been, people have looked at many different models, compared different models for certain applications. So there's a chance that somebody has looked at turbulence modeling for your type of application. But if not, maybe that's the, maybe this could help you to start up how you're going to do this thing. And again, you may have to do model comparison. So one other thing, we talked about fully turbulent flows and we talked about laminar flows, but transition is even more difficult than turbulent flows. All the problems that we face in turbulent flows are also available or present in transitional flows and more. For example, transition is short in length and time, so this becomes even more challenging. You cannot assume a steady, so you cannot use the time averaging in a sense like that. So not only you have dissipation, you have amplification as well, dispersion as well in transition. And transition is kind of a selective process. You know, certain instability all of a sudden becomes amplified and dispersed. So transition type of flows, DNS is very expensive and very demanding. LES seems not to work very well because there's not a subgrid model that works well for transition methods. And then RAN seems to be used, but in order for you to use it, you need some sort of empirical transition correlation to begin with. So you could see the difficulty using transition. So that's a field unto itself for transition flows. So I'm going to talk about some case studies, just like here, these type of problem I was talking about. So people have done some case studies, and that could be helpful for you to decide, for example, what kind of modeling you want to use. So this is a NASA study, so if you go to here, you'll see this study. That they looked at a diffuser, and they wanted to see different Y fluxes and different turbulence modeling, how that would work. So, and they looked at it, and they looked at SSD model, K epsilon model with different Y fluxes and wall function and wall integration, and they've got a bunch of different results. And if you go to read the report, and they have certain recommendations for this type of problem where you do have area enlargement where the velocity is going to go down and pressure picks up, so there is adverse pressure gradient which causes flow separation, flow reattachment. So that's one study. Here's another one from Stanford, and they looked at the different SA model, K epsilon, and so forth against experiments, and they saw that different angle of attack, the comparison with experiment, for example, the SA model did much better for higher angle of attack, and they looked at the K epsilon, they see that there's an excessive K is predicted near the stagnation area. So here's another study. These folks looked at Ahmed body. Ahmed body is a blunt body with massive wake separation, and it was tested a long time ago with very good experimental results. So a lot of folks have looked at this. They looked at if they have a blunt geometry. They've looked at Ahmed body first to verify their turbulence modeling, and this is one of them. These guys looked at different K epsilon and RSM methods and SST model, and they looked at it against the experiment, and you could see that RSM model with even 7 additional equations and more complexity, it didn't do so well for this type of problem, whereas using a Wald function did much better than that, and even SST model with Wald resolving all the way to the surface didn't do as much, and the best one was the K epsilon V2F model. So here is giving you some ideas of what worked really well compared to the other ones. Here's another study the ANSYS has done, and here's a wing, and they put that in a wind tunnel, and also looked at it in simulation, and they wanted to see the phenomena that they thought it was very important here was boundary layer vortex separation and swirling of the shear layers, and they looked at with SA model, realizable K epsilon, SST and RSTM, and they saw that the RSM methods that they had did really well for this case. So, if you look at what's going on in terms of what's the future trend, you would see that the new for RANs and eddy viscosity models, you're not going to see any more models in there. Not much more research really in there. You see some refinements, maybe more use of URANs, but nothing new like K epsilon and K omega and those kind of stuff. That's pretty much, I think, people are more interested in LES and maybe combining these two and using DES. So there would be more use of DES, I believe, more testing, more model development. You'll see hybrid URANs and LES working together, which we call DES. More research in application for LES, and maybe, of course, DNS would be still in some research areas people are looking at. So that's a trend I think is present to us right now. It's apparent to us. If you need more resources, there's a bunch of different resources. I'll put them right here. So I think these are very helpful. This is I've used this thing extensively. This is I think it's available on the internet. It's from Chalmers University, and it talks about really the turbulence model in detail. There's a couple of websites. One is from NASA Langley. It really does describe turbulence modeling in details as well. And another good one, really I enjoy looking at and reading and learning is from CFD Online. It's about turbulence modeling. David Wilcox, who did K omega, designed K omega, has a textbook that talks about that, and not only K omega, but it's about turbulence modeling. And again, there are some resources in test cases where you could use to look at comparison against test cases. And if you want your own test cases, ECOFTAC has a database, and I think you have to be members to be able to use that. But that's very helpful as well, where there's a lot of test cases, data available to you. So, for example, some geometry like this, the data, the simulation, everything is available there, so you can use. Okay, so that brings us to questions. I don't know if there's any question. I don't have any questions here. We set aside some time at the end of the first and the second to answer some questions, but I don't have anything right now. If you do have questions, again, by all means use the forum or send me emails. More than glad to touch base with you and try to answer your questions. But this should give you an overview of turbulence modeling.